47 years, a period long enough for things to fade, long enough for an entire town to forget the name that once made them silently bow their heads. But there was one mother, for all that time, who could not forget the death of her daughter, when every question remained unanswered. Until one day, in the dusty basement of the police station, a young detective stumbled upon a bloodstain, small, forgotten, but never gone. And from that moment, he knew some truths should not remain in the past. Langley, autumn 2021. Early morning, the small town still hadn't awakened. In the basement of the Langley police station, Nathan Leclerc was rummaging through an old file cabinet, wearing thin fabric gloves, sighing at the layers of dust clinging to the leather-bound folders. The room was damp, filled with the odor of decaying paper and rusting steel, the flickering fluorescent light the only sign of life. Nathan was 32 years old, his face not yet rugged, but also lacking any trace of innocence. A small scar on his left cheek, a souvenir from his first case back in the city, didn't make him look dangerous, just made people wonder what he had been through. He had moved back to Langley 3 months ago, citing a desire to slow down. But in his heart, he knew better than anyone. There were some truths he needed to avoid for a while. The chief had given him the task of going through that cold case pile, if anyone even cares anymore. Unsolved cases, no witnesses, no conclusions, names that had once been someone's pain, now just itemized entries. And then he saw it. A silver-gray file buried beneath a stack of other papers, the edges worn, but the lettering still crisp in black ink. Pryor, Sharon, 1975. He pulled out the file and placed it on the cold metal desk. As he opened the first page, a small slip of paper, almost falling out with the gentle breeze, drifted to the floor. It was a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed, the handwriting shaky but clear. "I know you are busy, but please try again. That blood sample, please don't let it disappear like my daughter. Joan Pryor." Nathan sat still for a moment, not because of the letter, but because of how it said everything. A plea without tears, without accusations, just the perseverance of someone who had waited too long and still refused to give up. He checked the evidence code mentioned in the file, then left the record room, following the corridor down to the evidence storage area. The iron door opened with a screech like fingernails scraping on glass. In the dim light of a weak bulb, he saw the shelf labeled CR75. The box was wrapped in yellowed plastic. The tape on the lid was cracked with age. Nathan carefully removed the wrapping and opened the box. Inside, only a light gray women's jacket, old wool worn at the cuffs. He used tweezers to lift each layer of fabric, turning it inside out. And he saw it. A dried blood stain, small but distinct, stuck to the inside of the left sleeve. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. There was no note indicating that this blood sample had ever been tested. No DNA comparison information. No lab code. Only a typewritten line from nearly half a century ago. Jacket does not belong to the victim. Could be from the suspect or a witness. Temporarily stored. A moment of confusion ran through Nathan's mind. Not because of the blood, but because of the neglect. He carefully folded the jacket, put it in a new evidence bag, and relabeled it. His hands didn't shake, but his heart did. In his head, a question repeated like a steady drumbeat. Why didn't anyone check it with new technology? Maybe they had wanted to. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they forgot. Nathan sat in the record room for another hour. He read Sharon Pryor's file from beginning to end. A young veterinarian disappeared in March 1975. Found 4 days later at the edge of the forest, bound, tortured, and finally killed. No witnesses, no testimonies. A few suspects, but not enough for a conclusion. The case was closed in 1990, then reopened in 2001, then faded completely into oblivion. He closed his eyes to imagine the face of the girl that year, Sharon, in the last moments of her life. Did she know that someone was still searching? that her blood, or the blood of the person who took her life, was still in this cold basement, waiting for a hand to touch it? When he opened his eyes, Nathan felt it clearly. He had inadvertently stumbled upon a door that had been covered in dust for nearly half a century, and even though he didn't know what was behind that door, he knew he couldn't help but step forward. The next day, Nathan parked in front of a wooden house at the end of an unnamed street. Only a small sign in front of the wooden fence, PRIOR, was rusted, almost unreadable unless you stood very close. He rang the bell. A moment later, the door opened. No footsteps, no sound of a bolt being drawn. The door simply slowly creaked open, and the old woman stood there, not trembling, not cowering, not surprised. Her eyes were the first thing that made Nathan pause. Not dull like the old people he had met, not weak like he had imagined, but direct, like someone who was used to being judged and no longer felt the need to pretend. "You're the 17th person to come and ask me," she said, her voice even without greeting. "And this time, I don't expect much either." Nathan stood still for a beat, then nodded slightly. "I'm Detective Leclerc, ma'am. I'm reviewing your daughter's case, Sharon Pryor." Joan looked at him, her eyes unclear whether they were scrutinizing or sad. She replied slowly, "You're young. You probably still think every case can be solved by finding the truth, right?" She sighed, then shook her head, her voice small but firm. "It's not like that. I just need to talk for a bit." She turned inside, not inviting, nor telling him to follow. But Nathan understood and entered the house. The space inside the house was very different from the outside. The walls were still rough wood but clean. Every item was old but placed neatly and tidily. "Sit down," Jones said, then poured tea into two mismatched cups. One was plain porcelain, one had a hand-painted cat. "I haven't had two matching cups in a long time." Nathan took out his notebook. He was cautious. "I want to ask you about an item of evidence, the jacket found near the scene. According to the file, it didn't belong to Sharon." "It wasn't hers," Jones said immediately without thinking. "I sewed every piece of clothing my daughter wore. That jacket wasn't hers." Nathan stopped writing. "You said sewed?" She nodded slightly. "I worked at a textile factory back then. She didn't like wearing store-bought clothes. She said they were itchy. Her clothes always had cotton lining that I sewed by hand into the collar." Nathan thought for a moment, then asked, "Do you remember anyone who owned that jacket? Or could it have belonged to someone else in the neighborhood?" Joan frowned. For the first time, her expression drifted into the distance. "No one claimed it. The police took it around to ask. Then they stopped." "The blood on the jacket." Nathan lowered his voice. "It's not Sharon's." Joan turned to look at him. "I know." The answer was so simple that it was almost frightening. "How do you know?" Nathan asked, almost whispering. When the police returned Sharon's belongings, her wallet, handkerchief, another jacket, they said that blood-stained jacket wasn't hers. The blood on it didn't match. Joan paused, as if reconsidering something she had never accepted. "They said it didn't match, so it wasn't relevant. Besides, they said at the time that there was no way to test it." She looked up, her eyes meeting Nathan's. "Do you think that's okay? To have blood, to have evidence, and they just ignore it because it doesn't fit with the rest." He noted it down, underlining 3 times the line, "Blood doesn't match, ignored." In his head, small doors were opening, subtle knocks of irregularity, not big enough to turn an investigation around, but too clear to ignore. Joan got up slowly, taking from the cabinet a faded envelope. Inside was a copy of the letter she had sent to the police station, stamped in red ink, "Received." Below was a pencil note from someone. "No legal value." "How many letters like this did you write?" Nathan asked. 36, she replied. 1 every year, 2 some years. Only 3 were answered. 1 was a form letter. 1 was handwritten. but the signature was wrong. One was to report that the file had been closed. There was no anger in her voice, just the slow bleed of patience. Nathan carefully folded the letter and said, "I'm going to send the blood sample for retesting." "Maybe this time." Joan raised her hand. "I don't need to hear hope, Detective. I have plenty of it. But I need to know, did you happen to read the part in Sharon's file where they said they didn't find her personal diary?" Nathan nodded. "They're wrong," she said. "She did write a small notebook, red, recording every case, every cat, every dog, even the special owners. But that book was never listed." Nathan straightened up. "Do you know where it is?" "No," she replied. "But I know Sharon hid it where only someone familiar with her habits would know. She never kept her diary on her bedside table, afraid I'd read it, but in a place where no one would care." He wrote everything down. Before leaving, he stood at the threshold and turned back. "Is there anything you want to say, if this case finds an answer?" Joan looked at him, slowly smiling for the first time, but not a relieved smile, but as if someone had witnessed too much to believe in the easy. Nathan left the house in the fading evening light. He turned to look back one last time. The wooden door ajar, the Prior sign shaking gently in the wind, and an old figure sitting behind the window frame, motionless, as if she were still guarding the memory of someone no one called by name anymore. But now there was someone. He would call that name again, and this time, someone would listen. The jacket, wrapped in a new sealed plastic bag, had traveled nearly half a century to get here. Nathan stood still for a moment, looking at the dried blood sample carefully separated and attached to a special tube. Every movement was precise, emotionless. "You're really going to do this?" A voice sounded behind him. It was Lieutenant Garner, in charge of administration, who had been here since fax machines were still new technology. He walked over, hands in his pockets, his eyes not exactly annoyed, just the experienced look of someone who had seen too many cases that should have been left alone. "The testing budget has been cut 3 times this year," he said. "The department can only approve funding for open cases. And this," he nodded toward the blood sample, "is from 75, Leclerc. You know that." Nathan didn't turn around. "But what if that blood sample belongs to the perpetrator?" Garner chuckled, not mockingly, but half sympathetically, half resigned. "And what if it doesn't? What if it's just the blood of a hunter who scratched his leg and threw the jacket away? How are you going to write a report to explain spending $3,000 on a vague possibility?" "Then I'll be the one to write that report," Nathan said, still evenly. "And I'll take responsibility." Garner sighed and pulled up a chair to sit next to the table. "You just moved back here a few months ago. I understand the enthusiasm. But don't forget, enthusiasm doesn't translate into budget." Nathan entered the final command. Compare with the National DNA Database. No time limit. No limit to the level of match. Garner looked at the command displayed, then clicked his tongue, his voice low. "I hope you're right. Otherwise, I'm afraid your faith won't be the only thing under scrutiny." In the afternoon, Nathan went to the town library, where the basement was the Langley archive, where they stored each year in rusty iron drawers, newspaper pressed with plastic to prevent rotting. He followed the year 1975. The Langley Sentinel, the issue at the end of March, had a special page dedicated to Sharon Pryor's funeral. He discovered an anomaly. A black and white photo taken at a wide angle, the family standing by the coffin, a few neighbors sitting in the back rows, and on the right edge, almost out of the frame, was a strange man. No name, no caption. His face was partially obscured by the light, but his eyes were still clear. Staring at the coffin, not sad, not bowing his head, but as if he were observing a rare object. Nathan carefully removed the original photo from the back of the newspaper. Someone had attached it long ago. And there, in blue ballpoint pen that had almost faded, was a handwritten note. He was there too. Sharon never looked at him, but he looked at her. The writing was close to the edge of the photo, slanted as if trying to hide it from a quick glance. It made Nathan stop, not only because of the content, but because of the tone. Not panicky, not angry, no accusation. Nathan touched the faded ink lightly. A strange feeling suddenly came over him, as if old eyes were looking through him, asking him to continue the question they hadn't had time to ask. He photographed the picture, recorded the archive code, and left the library, his heart filled with an indefinable void. That afternoon, he returned to police headquarters. Garner was in the storage room, rearranging a pile of paper files that had been eaten away at one corner by moths. The smell of old ink and damp paper filled the room. "Lieutenant," Nathan said, "do you know who was in charge of the Sharon Pryor case? The first people, I mean, the ones who were really there when everything was new?" Garner looked up. His eyes met Nathan's, and for a moment, for some reason, he paused. The silence lasted longer than a breath. "I knew some people," he said slowly, putting the stack of files on the table. "I was new to the force back then, working as a file assistant. Not directly involved, but I saw a few things." "So, who led the investigation?" Nathan asked. Garner licked his lips as if rummaging through his memory, or considering something that was not easy to say. "It was Police Chief Franklin Mays," he replied. "A good man, but he retired early, died a few years after that case." Nathan nodded, but the feeling that Garner was still hiding something kept him from looking away. "Is something wrong, sir?" Garner looked at him again, longer. "You know, Leclerc," he said softly, "the way you stand in the file room, holding an old photo, silent as if you're listening to the dead speak, I've seen it before. The same eyes, the same way of not giving up on a line on the edge of a paper." Nathan slowly asked, "Who?" Garner didn't answer immediately. He turned away, opening another file cabinet, as if to escape the facing eyes. "Someone," he said, "who used to believe that if you kept looking patiently, the truth would appear." Then he stopped, saying no more. Nathan understood. Some strings were not ready to be pulled tight. But he also knew that next time Garner wouldn't evade. Nathan took the photo back to Joan, who opened the door after the second knock, not surprised to see Nathan return. "Did you discover something new?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yes," Nathan held up the photo. "I found it in the library." Joan took the photo, put on her reading glasses. She said nothing for a moment. Her eyes didn't blink. Her hand trembled slightly. The first time Nathan had seen that. "The man standing at the edge. Do you recognize him?" She nodded. "I know that man, but I don't know his name." "Have you ever met him?" 3 months before Sharon disappeared," she said, her eyes still fixed on the photo. "He started showing up in front of the clinic, never went inside, always stood by the fence, where the lilac bushes were, smoking, watching." "What was he watching?" Nathan asked, softly. "Watching Sharon," she replied, "but not the way someone sees a beautiful young girl. He looked like someone who was waiting for something, an opportunity, an opening." She stopped, her hands clenched slightly together. "Sharon used to play with the puppies in the backyard. The children around the street would run after her. Once, I saw him standing there, holding a cigarette in his hand, his eyes not blinking, watching as Sharon hugged a little girl who had just been bitten by a dog but was still smiling. I asked him what he needed. He just nodded and left." "Did you tell the police?" Nathan asked. "I told them." One of them shook his head. "He's a temporary neighbor, came from Cumberland. No reason to worry." Then they ignored it. She sat up straight. "But I didn't forget. Not one day." The room was silent. No more rain knocking on the roof. Just the sound of time passing very quietly, as if afraid to interrupt something sacred. Nathan took the paper from the file and placed it down. "Do you still have anything about Sharon? Anything that someone like him might be interested in?" Joan looked at him for a moment, then got up, slowly like someone walking through a mist in their memory. "Follow me." Joan's basement was colder than Nathan had imagined. The smell of old wood, moldy fabric, and something like dried flowers still lingered somewhere. She turned on a small incandescent light, the dim yellow light revealing paper boxes and old iron file cabinets, all arranged neatly like a private library with only one reader. "Here," she said, pulling a tin box from the corner of the room, with a brass lock with faded letters. She opened it with an old key worn on a necklace around her neck. Inside were the things Sharon had written. They were Sharon's diary and could also be considered professional notes, apprenticeship papers, detailed descriptions of dog and cat illnesses, the names of each animal, each owner. There were notes that made Nathan stop. "Little Ava, 5 years old, is afraid of dogs barking. Use cats as an intermediary. Good results. Uncle Amos, dog has arthritis, needs help getting into the car. Appointment on Friday. Told not to talk much, he forgets the time." Finally, they found a red notebook, the cover worn, but still with blurred ink. Internship, 1974 to 75. Nathan flipped through each page as if turning over the very soul of the deceased. The neat, full lines, bearing the traces of a young person who loved life, loved even the smallest things in her work. At the last page, he slowed down. The paper was torn. But something was wrong. Nathan gently peeled back the lining, where it folded in to reinforce the spine of the notebook. A small piece of paper was stuffed in there, pressed so close that it almost dissolved into the spine. He took it out, read it. The handwriting was slanted, sharp, unlike Sharon's. She never looks around. She always bows her head. At 7:05, she walks alone. Tomorrow will come earlier. Nathan frowned, his voice soft but sharp. "Oh my God." Joan reached out, took it. She read slowly, word by word, not crying. But her voice sank as if she were sliding into a bottomless abyss. "This is his handwriting," she said, "not Sharon's." Sharon wrote round, soft. "This is from an observer, an obsessive person." Nathan tightened his grip on the notebook. The cold words echoed from the past, each stroke of ink carrying the breath of lurking. He had been there, recording, planning, and this piece of paper had been here for decades, right in her hands, just waiting for someone who knew how to see. He looked up at Joan, his voice low but suppressed. "Why didn't you give it to the police before? Even when you met me? Why didn't you say anything?" Joan was silent for a few seconds. She didn't avoid, but she didn't rush to answer either. Her hand rested on the lid of the tin box. Her fingers trembled slightly to the rhythm of her pulse. "Because I used to believe them. Believe that if I kept it long enough, carefully enough, that when I gave it to them, they would know what to do." She looked up, her eyes no longer just pain, but the weariness of someone who had bet on trust many times. But they didn't look, didn't listen. A piece of paper like that, to them, is trash. "And you," she added, her voice softening. "When I first met you, I wasn't sure you would be different. A young person, enthusiastic. But enthusiastic people are also easy to give up." She paused for a moment, then smiled, very softly, as if that smile had been folded up for nearly half a century. "Today I saw. You're not like them. You know how to listen." Joan placed the notebook back in the box, then looked up, her eyes darkened by a light that was not at all weak, but of a smoldering fire, cherished and nurtured year after year. "He thought he had erased her," she whispered, "but I kept her soul, for 47 years. She looked at Nathan, for the first time, not just gratitude, but something deeper, quieter, as if she had just handed over an invisible necklace called justice. "And now," she said, "it's time for someone else to continue holding on to that." Nathan stood there, among the layers of memories that had never faded, in the heart of a mother who had buried her child with anger and memory, and knew time does not erase everything, not if someone remembers, not if someone waits. And from this moment, no one had to wait alone anymore. Night fell on Langley like a heavy curtain. Nathan's office was lit only by the light from the computer screen. He had waited 3 days for the test results. The blood sample, something almost forgotten in the evidence room for 46 years, was now in the national database system, ready to be compared with anyone who had left genetic traces in the criminal record. When the words "match found" flashed on the screen, Nathan didn't have time to take a deep breath. The name appeared: Franklin Romine, gender male, born 1943, residence Cumberland Town, more than 40 miles from Langley. The portrait in the file was a photo taken in 2009, a middle-aged man with deep eyes, high forehead, short cropped hair, a face without a trace of emotion. Not the gaze of an innocent person, but of someone who was used to not being seen. He clicked to expand the file. 1971, arrested for stalking women at a boarding house, later released for lack of evidence. 1978, 1983, 1989, 3 times accused of physical abuse, all never brought to court. 1996, investigated for threatening to kill an ex-girlfriend, no official charges. A note from the FBI Psychological Analysis Department, written in 2003, subject displays obsessive behavior with specific targets, female, young, solitary. Nathan sat quietly for a moment. His throat dried up, not because of fear, but because something had slipped out of the shadows of the past, crawled onto the surface of the present, ready to breathe the air of truth. He pressed the print button. The rain outside was heavier, as if the sky didn't want to be silent anymore either. He got up, intending to get more files when the phone rang. Anti-theft alarm, personal vehicle, parking lot number 3. Nathan rushed out of the office. The Langley police station parking lot had no roof. The rear entrance was lit only by a single high-pressure lamp. Rain slammed into his face in waves, freezing cold. Nathan's car, a silver Chevrolet, was still in place. No broken glass, no forced locks. But the back door, on the right side, was ajar. His heart pounded as he approached, his hand on the door handle as if touching the flesh of a wild beast lurking. He opened it. In the first moment, nothing was strange, until he saw a piece of paper, folded in half, placed neatly on the back seat, not wet. Someone had entered the car in the rain, put it down, and left without a trace. He opened it. The handwritten writing was slanted, old, the black ink slightly smeared with water, as if raindrops had deliberately left a trace. Some things should be left in the past, detective. No name, no clear fingerprints, nothing to prove, except the fact that someone was watching him. Arriving home, Nathan didn't go in right away. He stood still in the car, his hands on the steering wheel, his eyes staring straight at the dark house ahead, as if waiting for something to appear from the darkness. The feeling that someone had sat in the back seat of his car still lingered, like a cold handprint on his neck. He pulled the handgun from under the seat, got out, quietly circled around the back, checking every window. No signs of forced entry, but that didn't mean it was safe. Entering the house, he didn't turn on the lights. His hand turned on the laptop, plugged in the portable hard drive, the security camera system he had installed manually, running independently, not through the network. He rewound the recording from the day. Everything was normal until 21:42. The screen shook slightly. The image then went blank. No movement, no interference, just a clean void, lasting exactly 10 minutes. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. Not accidental, not amateur. This technique, neat, clean, and too familiar. Not an impulsive vandal, but someone who had done this many times. Nathan leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. The room was silent, only the sound of rain hitting the window pane. He turned back to look at the screen, where Franklin Romine's photo was still displayed, looking straight at the camera, with eyes that seemed to have been waiting for him for a long time. "You've lived in the dark long enough," he said softly. "Now is the time I'm going to drag you into the light." Outside the window, the rain still fell. But in Nathan's heart, another storm had begun. No longer doubt, but the hunt. The wooden house nestled along a dirt road on the edge of Cumberland, where wild bushes obscured most of the front, and the house number was rusted to the point of being unreadable. Without accurate administrative records, Nathan would have thought this place had long been uninhabited. But Franklin Romine still lived here, as quietly as a shadow. That morning, he was invited to the police station under the pretext of checking residential records. No resistance, no questions, not even an escort. He walked straight into the interrogation room as if he had been there many times in his head. While he sat still, his hands clasped in front of him, looking at the wall as if waiting for rain, the investigation team coordinated by Nathan with the Cumberland police conducted a house search with a warrant signed based on DNA evidence and the notes from Sharon's notebook. Franklin's house door wasn't locked, just ajar. Inside was a strong, musty odor. "No signs that anyone has been here for many years," the chief investigator commented. The living room was empty, just a tattered armchair, a wooden table with knife marks. No family photos. No personal belongings. Nathan said nothing. He felt something was hidden deeper. When they entered the bedroom, the forensics team stopped. Under the worn carpet was a loose piece of wood, nailed back manually with old iron nails. Nathan bent down, using a crowbar to remove each nail. The plank popped up, revealing a small space, just enough to hide a heavy iron box. Not a combination lock, but a sliding type, double-locked with a handmade stainless steel hook. "This won't be easy to open," an officer said. Nathan didn't answer. He took a lock-picking tool and poked it lightly into the lock. It seemed to be rusted. A strong jerk, the lock popped open. The creaking of the hinges sounded like someone groaning in their throat. Inside were items arranged neatly to the point of being creepy. At the top layer, newspaper clippings about Sharon Pryor, from old articles that the town library had stopped storing decades ago. Some were folded at the corners, some were wrapped in nylon. In the corner of some photos, there were red ink marks. 6:47 p.m. Don't turn around. Tuesday. Under the photos, a copy of Sharon's high school yearbook, with a portrait of the girl crossed out with a red diagonal line like a map of the end. The other faces were not marked, only Sharon. "Oh my God," an officer muttered. Nathan still hadn't spoken. He knew there was something deeper. Finally, they found a thick notebook, black leather cover, embossed with the word "Notes." No name, no date, but inside was the history of an obsession. First page. "She strokes the white cat's ear. It likes that. On Tuesday, she doesn't wear a hat. Her hair is tied low, like her yearbook photo. She never looks around. At 7:05, she walks alone. On the 11th, she stopped to comfort a child who had fallen. Likes animals, likes children." Nathan felt his throat dry. Not just disgust, but familiarity. He had recorded what Sharon did, just like she used to take notes for young patients and abandoned dogs and cats. But the difference was, in Sharon's hands it was a memory. In his hands, it was a plan. Page 17. She returns to the clinic at 6:42, never notices anyone following. The trunk is locked, silent for 47 minutes. No one heard. The smell of veterinary medicine can't cover up the smell of blood. Nathan let go. The notebook fell on the old wooden table, making a dry sound. The whole room seemed to go silent. An officer stepped forward, intending to say something, but Nathan raised his hand to signal. He bent down, turning the last pages. The penultimate page. She didn't cry much, maybe because she understood that no one could hear. "I don't like it when she turns to look." But she didn't beg, didn't say, "Please don't." Just looked straight. The last page, a solitary line, undated. "I have completed the collection. Now she can be silent." Nathan stood there, his hand still gripping the corner of the table, blood rushing to his temples. A mixture of outrage, shock, and an unnameable feeling, standing among the relics of evil, looking into the soul of someone who didn't believe in regret. He slowly closed the lid of the box. No one said anything. Franklin Romine was still sitting in the interrogation room, still silent. But this time, silence was no longer a shield. Nathan entered the room, his gaze no longer that of a suspector, but that of someone carrying evidence. Sharon's notebook, newspaper clippings, the last note. Franklin looked at him, didn't speak, didn't resist, just twitched one side of his mouth, a smile that Nathan couldn't call a challenge. Not exactly a victory either. It was a fermented contentment, like a sick artist had completed his final work in the dark. But now, the darkness was no longer his. The interrogation room at the Langley police station was a square room with no mirrors, no windows, just a metal table and two chairs facing each other, where truth and lies sat down like two inseparable figures. Franklin Romine had sat still since being brought in. He did not request a lawyer. He did not ask why. He did not offer any conditions. His hair was white to the roots, his cheekbones bare, his lips neither dry nor wet. His hands were clasped together in front of his chest, like a person praying, but not to anyone. Nathan walked in, carrying a bag of files, the black notebook, and the gaze of someone who was used to working with people who no longer possessed humanity. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't fear nor disgust. It was a strange form of stillness, like before a storm that had been foretold, but no one believed. Outside the room, behind the one-way glass, Joan Pryor stood silently. In her hand was a photo of Sharon, the girl in the yellow jacket from years ago, her smile still intact in the memory of a mother who would never forget. Nathan sat down, not opening the file right away. He looked straight at Franklin, not hatefully, not scornfully, just an irreversible presence. "Do you know why you're here?" Franklin raised his face. He smiled. He did not answer immediately. He was silent for a few minutes, then tilted his head as if thinking of something distant. Finally, he asked, "Is she still remembered?" Nathan did not react. He opened the file bag, pulled out each piece of evidence, each photo, each line, each DNA trace, not to convince, but to reshape the person sitting in front of him. He was not a mystery, but a period mark waiting to be written. Franklin did not look at the evidence. He looked at his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, not because of fear, but because of age. But his eyes were still the same, empty. Nathan opened the notebook, a copy from the iron box found under his house. He turned to the last page, pointing to the writing. "I have completed the collection. Now she can be silent." "Is this your handwriting?" Franklin glanced at it. Then, like a person who had just been called by name in a dream, he nodded very slightly. No heaviness, no defense. "She thought she was good, kind," he said, his voice even as if reciting an old recipe. "But kindness doesn't help when you're locked in a trunk. I just wanted her to know, no one is untouchable." Nathan suppressed a breath, not because of anger, but because of the coldness that was spreading from the other side of the table from a cold-blooded killer. "How long did you follow her?" "I can't count," Franklin replied. "I don't count anything. I just observed her very carefully before I acted." Franklin chuckled softly. The smile had no sound, just a slight movement at the corners of his mouth. "She loved animals," he said. "If she saw something in pain, she had to help. But she couldn't save herself." "What did she do to you to deserve that?" Nathan asked. Franklin was silent for a moment, then shook his head. "It's true that she did nothing. But people like her irritated me, because of their false sanctity." Outside, Joan stood like a statue. She had thought she would close her eyes if she had to hear him speak, but no. She opened her eyes wide, seeing clearly every movement of his lips, every wrinkle around his mouth. as if wanting to remember the last time the form of the person who had stolen her child. "She didn't scream," Franklin continued. "Didn't plead, I didn't expect it. But there was a moment when she looked at me, not contemptuously, not scared, as if she was understanding me. And that made me hate her even more." "Because it made you see yourself as weak and pitied," Nathan said. Franklin raised his head. "Yes," he nodded. "She looked at me as if I were human, not a monster, and that made me want to prove that she was wrong. And that young detective, Nathan something." He glanced quickly at the prosecutor's row, then looked straight at the jury. "At first, I thought he was like other young people, noisy for a few months and then moved on. This town is full of people who thought they could change something." Franklin smiled slightly, without a sound, just a twitch of the lips like a wound that hadn't healed. "So, I tried to make him hesitate, in a small way, nothing harmful, just to remind him that some things should be left alone, especially when they have been lying still for nearly half a century." He turned to Nathan, his voice still steady. "You kept the camera off the network. Pretty smart, but not enough. I used to work in a place where people knew how to clean up traces, and not everyone remembers that." Then he turned back to the front, closing his aging hands as if washing away the dust of time. "Finally, I guess it wasn't enough to stop you either. Well then, congratulations." Not a word of apology, not a sign of regret, just acceptance, as if it were a game he had played to the end and lost for the first time in his life. The room was silent. Nathan lowered his hand, no longer maintaining the demeanor of an investigator. He asked in a lower voice, "Do you regret it?" Franklin pursed his lips, shook his head. I don't regret it. I'm not sorry, but I admit it. That's all." Joan still stood there, her eyes fixed on him. She didn't break the glass, didn't scream. She didn't need to. On the day the court opened the trial of Franklin Romine, the sky in Langley was neither rainy nor sunny, just a white-gray sky, as if the world was pausing to hold its breath. The town's small courthouse, which was only accustomed to dealing with chicken theft or land disputes, was packed today. The seats were full. The old wooden floor creaked under the footsteps of old people leaning on canes and young people who hadn't even been born when Sharon disappeared. A middle-aged woman clutched an old photo, Sharon standing in front of the veterinary clinic, white coat, holding a small dog that was sticking its tongue out and smiling. Some people brought flowers, some people just brought silence. Joan Pryor arrived a few minutes late, not because she was weak, but because something in her needed to be kept very slow, like the steps of someone who had gone too far to turn back. She wore a long black dress, a gray wool shawl, and in her hand was not just a wooden cane, but a photo frame, an old-fashioned wooden frame, worn at the edges, but wiped clean without a speck of dust. Inside was Sharon, still that smile, still those eyes. Franklin Romine was brought to the courtroom in a light gray prison uniform, his wrists lightly handcuffed. He walked slowly, his head slightly bowed, not looking at anyone, not because of remorse, but because he didn't need to look anymore. Everything he needed to see, he had recorded 46 years ago. No one shouted. No one demanded to hit him. No one shed tears. The whole room was a storm that had gathered enough pain, now just waiting for the arm of the law to sweep through. The prosecutor, a gray-haired woman, her voice clear and sharp as a bell, presented the case file with irrefutable evidence. DNA traces from the jacket, the notebook with the defendant's handwriting, the excerpts of obsessive notes matching the victim's habits, the iron box buried under the floorboards of the defendant's house, and the undeniable confirmation from Franklin Romine himself. No apologies, no evasions. "Your Honor," the prosecutor concluded, "the victim of this case, Sharon Pryor, was killed, forgotten by the system, by time, but not forgotten by her mother. And today, justice does not just speak the truth. It speaks that Silence is no longer an option. The room was silent, not because it was too emotional, but because everyone understood, at this moment, no one needed to shout. The court invited Joan Pryor, the representative of the victim, to speak. She stood up, slowly like someone who did not carry age, but a burden called memory. Nathan stood nearby, his eyes following every step she took. No one stopped her, no one rushed her. She walked as if all of time was stopping to make way. When she came before Franklin, she did not look straight at him. She looked at the table between them, where she placed the photo of her daughter down. The whole room was silent. She said, her voice not trembling, but deep as from the bottom of a soul that had never been at peace. "You thought you erased her? You only killed her body, but I kept her soul for 47 years. You lived in the dark. I lived in pain. But I won." She raised her head, her eyes looking straight into his, not afraid, not trembling, not hateful. "Because justice does not decay, even when you have rotted." Franklin did not respond. He looked at her for a few seconds, then lowered his eyes, not because of remorse, but because he knew that silence at this time was no longer a weapon. The judge, an old man who had been sitting in the courtroom for more than 30 years, stood up. His voice was deep and firm. "Defendant Franklin Romine, with all the irrefutable evidence and the confirmation from yourself, the court declares life imprisonment without parole." No one applauded. No one burst into tears. But something had dissipated in the air, like a thick layer of dust that had just been swept away. A town that had been silent now breathed. Joan left the courtroom with Nathan. No one helped her. Not needed. When she reached the stone steps, she stopped. The wind was cold, but the sky was higher. Nathan asked, "Are you okay?" Joan didn't answer right away. She just looked down at the photo of her daughter, then said, "I no longer expect anyone to remember Sharon as I remember her. I just need one person, just one, to dare to look the truth in the face." Nathan squeezed her hand lightly. No more words. In a small town, justice does not come in armored cars or with sirens. It comes with perseverance and love that never dies. The following spring, the town of Langley both aged and became young again at the same time. The ice and snow had long melted, but it wasn't until the end of March that the first flowers dared to sprout through the barren soil around the foothills. The willow tree in front of the square began to let down its green hair, and the houses with tin roofs, once rusty, now echoed with the sound of hammers repairing the roofs, as if the entire town was being cleaned up from the roots. On a small plot of land behind the old church, where there used to be an abandoned soccer field, a new wooden house now stood. No signs, no slogans, just a low wooden gate on top of which a rustic phrase was hand-carved. Sharon's Rescue Center, where life is healed. Joan lived in the room behind that house, a small bright room with a window facing the bougainvillea trellis that stray cats loved to lie under in the shade. She had moved here from the winter after deciding to sell the old house, where Sharon's memories had become cracks in the walls. She didn't live alone anymore. A young nurse named Clara, short hair, bright eyes, lived with her like a granddaughter, a friend, a night watchman. Joan no longer woke up at 3 a.m. because of nightmares, not because she forgot, but because she had said what needed to be said. One morning in early April, Nathan came to visit. He wore a gray shirt, a worn leather jacket, and carried a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a small wooden frame, hand-carved with the phrase, "Justice is not time-bound." Joan took it without saying a word, just nodded, as if someone had just understood a sentence in a book she had hidden for half a lifetime. They sat on the porch, where there was a round table, 2 rattan chairs, and a pot of herbal tea giving off its scent. In the yard, lazy cats basked in the sun, a 3-legged dog was gnawing on a torn ball, and 3 children sat reading books under the willow tree. "It's been a year," Nathan said, looking into the distance. "Yes," Joan replied, pouring tea. But it feels like several lifetimes have passed. He turned the ceramic cup lightly in his hand, then suddenly asked, his voice slowly, "Do you still dream about him?" Joan was silent for a long time, then put the cup on the table, her eyes still looking at the leaves moving gently in the wind. "No," she replied. "I don't dream about him. I just hear my own footsteps, walking out of the darkness, lighter with each step." A moment later, she was the one who asked, "What about you, Nathan? Do you still dream about what was in his house?" Nathan leaned back. The ceiling was made of pine wood, the beams clearly visible like the spine of time. He took a breath, then nodded slightly. "Yes, but not like before." He turned to her, his eyes softening. "I dream of Sharon. Not the bound body, but the girl holding the white cat in her arms, smiling at me through the window. She doesn't say anything, but I understand." Joan did not respond, but her eyes were wet, as if in Nathan's dream she also saw a part of her daughter, a part that the past could not hold, but love did not let go of. When the sun began to shine, a little girl, her hair braided in 2 braids, her arms holding a black cat, came to give Joan a picture. On the paper was a picture of a woman sitting under a willow tree. Next to her was a white cat sleeping on her lap. "I drew you," the little girl said, then turned to Nathan. "And you're the one who caught the bad guy, right?" Nathan smiled softly and nodded. "Yes, only part of it. The other part is hers." The little girl didn't understand, just shrugged and ran away. Joan watched her, softly saying, "We can't fix everything, Nathan, but we can sow kindness again." That afternoon, as Nathan left the center, he turned to look back one last time. The wooden door had closed. The bougainvillea was still shaking. In his head, there was no longer the image of the iron box hidden under the floor, no longer the sound of the hinges creaking like the sound of a secret that had been imprisoned for too long. They were still there, like scars, but scars no longer hurt when we know we have survived. Langley wasn't a town of miracles, but that spring, no one was afraid of dreams anymore, because finally, dreams were no longer interrupted by darkness, and not just Joan's, but Nathan's too. For him, justice was not the sentence read aloud in court, not the dry numbers in the case summary report. Justice was when the old photo was no longer hidden in a dusty drawer, but hung on a wall where children played and life continued. He did not wear a medal, did not receive praise. But he knew that the task had been completed, not just for himself, but for the people who had been forgotten in the past. For Sharon, who walked in the light without knowing the darkness that had followed behind. For the things that had not been said, the evidence that had been dismissed, and the names that had been misspelled in the files. He had touched the old pain, not to recreate a legend, but to listen to the end of its truth. And that, to him, was the reward that didn't need to be announced. Now, every time he closed his eyes, he no longer saw the iron box hidden under the wooden floor, no longer heard the hinges creaking like the voice of a secret that had been imprisoned for too long. Langley in October always carried a beautiful sadness. Sharon's rescue center in this season looked more like a fairy tale house than a place that once reflected a bloody memory. The willow had shed almost all of its leaves, leaving only the slender branches hanging over the fence. Under the tree, a few cats were curled up next to the stone pedestal that had been placed there not long ago. The pedestal was low, unpretentious. The top was flat, clean, deeply engraved with a bronze inscription: "Where life is healed, and memory is never forgotten." A girl about 9 years old was kneeling in front of a cage, trying to soothe a shivering white kitten. The cat had a gray mark on its forehead, exactly like the cat Sharon used to hold when taking photos in front of the clinic. The girl was a new volunteer. Her name was Mia, who had just moved to town with her mother after a divorce. Silent, shy, but had a special way of making cats feel safe. She picked up the kitten and released it into the lap of Joan, who was sitting in the yard under the rare sunshine of late autumn. Joan was wearing her old wool shawl, the color of blue-gray like the sky after the rain. She sat in the rattan chair, leaning forward slightly, her hands gently supporting the kitten, as if holding a piece of time that had just fallen into her hands. The cat rubbed its head against her chest, then fell asleep. No cries, no resistance. Joan said nothing. She just stroked lightly along the animal's spine, her eyes not looking at it, but looking further, past the bougainvillea hanging down from the eaves, past the wooden fence, where behind it was the sky and the wind and the silence of a season closing. At the center gate, Mia stopped. She was sweeping the yard, curiously reading the words on the bronze plaque that was cleverly attached next to the fence. Her voice was clear, young, slightly stumbling, but clear. Where life is healed, and memory is never forgotten. The little girl looked up at the house, as if trying to understand why the adults had carved such a sentence into stone. No one answered. But on the porch, Joan smiled softly. The afternoon drifted towards sunset. The small wooden house warmed up with the sound of cat paws, the sound of wind, the sound of the broom sweeping, and occasionally, the soft laughter of children. Somewhere in Joan's memory, the image of Sharon remained, no longer the painful figure in the forest, but the gentle figure passing through the doorway in a white coat, holding a cat, her eyes sparkling with sunlight. Nathan didn't come today. He had sent a letter, handwritten. "I can't fully understand your pain, but I understand. Pain does not erase the truth, and memory, if kept properly, can become a light for others." Joan read the letter, then folded it, putting it in a wooden box along with Sharon's photo. Not to hide, but to keep. As the sun began to set, the sunlight spread across the yard like a golden ribbon. A few children came earlier than usual. They sat on the ground, reading books to the cats, a strange habit but encouraged by Joan. The little girl Mia looked towards Joan, who was gently rocking the white cat to sleep, then looked at the bronze words again, as if this time she understood. This was not just a place to rescue animals. This was a place to keep what seemed to have been lost forever. The camera, if there was one, slowly moved away. The sound faded. The image faded. Only one last image remained. An old woman, sitting under a leafless tree holding a sleeping white cat, and behind her, carved in stone, "Where life is healed, and memory is never forgotten." Surely you have come across a gaze, not to see but to ask, does anyone still remember? If you have read this far, perhaps in you there is also a part of Joan, a pain that can never be fully told, and a part of Nathan, the persistence of someone who dares to touch the darkness, just to light a small light. The story of Sharon is not just an old case, but a reminder that justice sometimes lies not in the sentence, but in not letting anyone be forgotten. We retell this story based on real details, distilled and adapted to protect identities, while maintaining the spirit of what once happened, not to glorify, but to remember. If this story has made you pause for a beat, please share it via WhatsApp. Send it to a friend who is still searching for the truth, or a mother who is holding something in her heart that no one asks about, or simply a person who needs to know, listening is never useless. You can't turn back time, but you can make sure it doesn't pass silently. Send this story. Who knows, in some corner, someone will find themselves seen, for the first time, after a very long time.